moving into grazing management, it's part of the battle is getting your pasture where you want it to be, but the other part is maintaining it. And maintaining it needs to be done through properly grazing them. And so there's two key grazing styles that can be used, rotational or continuous. So rotational grazing, so here I have examples of two identical pastures. Rotational is going to be where you divide this big pasture into smaller kind of sub pastures. And then what you do is you'll go and turn horses out onto pasture 1. When that's all done and grazed, you then move them to pasture 2, and then you pull them off, move them to pasture 3. And ideally, by the time they're done grazing pasture 3, pasture 1 is ready to go again, and you can put horses back out on it. That's in comparison to, I'd say, a more traditional or common continuous grazing, where you have one big pasture, horses just live out there all the time. So the names are pretty self-explanatory. The rotational grazing is great because it helps prevent overgrazing because I'm rotating it, right? I give each set of the pasture rest. To an extent, you're kind of micromanaging how the horses are grazing. This can also reduce parasite exposure because when the horses are resting, maybe the parasites in pasture 1 are developing and infective, and the horses don't have access to them during that stage. But ultimately, rotational grazing, I am going to have more expensive fencing costs, right? But it's going to save a lot of money in terms of keeping your pasture healthy. I mentioned when we moved in, our pastures were continuously grazed and they were overgrazed and full of weeds because the weeds just kept outcompeting the grass because the grass was just put under these high pressure, intensely grazed situations. So we switched to a rotational grazing, and within year 1, our pastures were just immensely different. They got rest, they got the nutrients they needed, they were allowed to regrow successfully, and the pastures were just beautiful. So it saved us a lot of money because continuous grazing, the horses would need to be on hay throughout the summer. Rotational grazing was enough to support our horses throughout the whole summer. One other thing with continuous is it may have less daily management. However, you can make rotational grazing easy, right? So we have just alley systems. So we just open the main gate so we keep a dry lot. That's where they have their shelter, their water. If we're providing them hay, they also have hay up there. And so they live up there or have access to this area all the time. And then we just do little gates or alleys into each pasture. So we can just open the gate from their dry lot and they go where they need to go. And so it really isn't that hard. And for our horses, ideally we kind of have half-acre pastures we put them in. One is 1 acre, and honestly, they're not micromanaged enough in that pasture. They don't even graze nearly all of it. They'll overgraze some areas, leave other areas really long. So we're probably going to split that one up to a half-acre too. But they go out, and then when they're done after about a week, we move them to the next one. And they stay on that for a week, and we move them to the next one. It's glorious. It works great. One thing I just do want to cover quickly is restricted grazing. And so these are when horses, so like for us, we open a gate and our horses have 24/7 access to that pasture until we're ready to move them to the next. Restricted grazing would be if I only opened that gate and gave them access to this pasture for an hour or 5 or 6 hours, just a limited amount of time in the day. And so a study was done in North Carolina, and they looked at it at 3, 6, 9, and 24-hour access to that pasture. Ultimately, what they found is that horses who were limited, who were provided restricted pasture access, they compensated by eating a lot. And so you see horses on 3 hours of pasture, they were able to consume, more than a third of what horses who were out there all day consumed in 3 hours. So what is that? 1/8 of the time. So thinking about that for horses who might have metabolic concerns, who cannot be on pasture all the time because they need limited non-structural carbohydrates in their diet. Restricted grazing, while great, horses are just going to gobble it down, and they know they have a limited time, so they eat really, really fast. And so it might not be everything you need it to be. So especially during restricted grazing, maybe using a grazing muzzle, but really just being careful for horses who do require restricted access. One other thing I want to talk about then is the steps for proper grazing. So I mentioned, and this is more with rotational grazing, but I mentioned we will put them on one pasture, then when that's done, we move them to the next, And it's not that simple. There are a few other steps involved. So when do I determine when the pasture is ready to graze? Well, I want to put my horses on the pasture when it is 6 to 8 inches tall. And honestly, that's not very tall. We used Nalgene water bottles. I know that's not the cool water bottle now, but back during grad school, that was. And so we'd put our Nalgene water bottles, and when the grass was just covering them, you can even just use a disposable plastic water bottle. When the glass covers it, or the grass covers it, now you are at the time to graze. And then we want to remove them at 3 to 4 inches. And so what we say is take half, leave half. And so what we are doing there is, you put them on at 6 to 8 and you're removing them at 3 to 4. So we want to leave enough so they can grow back. If you overgraze it, it's going to take a lot longer for them to grow back. So it's better to make sure you're leaving enough. After I remove the horses, I then mow it. And the mowing is very important because it's a great form of weed control. A lot of times the things that are left are the weeds. We really want to take down those weeds before seeds are produced, because the seeds will then exacerbate the problem with our weeds. So it also kind of takes care of those roughs, those areas where we have a ton of grass that the horses haven't consumed, or areas with the manure. So making sure we mow down to a uniform height is going to allow that uniform regrowth. There's also dragging, which is a little bit controversial. The thought is by breaking up that manure and kind of spreading it on the pasture, maybe I'm going to kill the parasites. And also I'm going to prevent these piles of manure from decreasing the quality of my grass. However, dragging might not actually kill those parasites. It has to be really hot and really dry for long periods of time. So up in the upper Midwest, we think that it doesn't get hot and dry enough for it to actually be detrimental to parasites. And now I'm just spreading them everywhere. In really hot climates, this may be beneficial, but we need more research to kind of figure that out. So in the ideal world, you are going up and picking up all that manure out of your pasture, but I know the feasibility of that is maybe a little tricky. We're then going to look at our pasture regrowth. And so pasture regrowth is going to vary based on a few things like the species, the season, a bunch of variables. And so we often see it around 21 days in the spring or the fall when things are growing very well. And it might be as spread out as 60 days in the summer when we're in this summer slump, when it's hot and dry. So you need to plan accordingly. I'm easily rotating my pastures. I can't get through the forage enough in the spring and fall. In the summer, we kind of hit a period where I'm making sure they have access to hay. Sometimes I have to remove them from pasture for a few weeks to make sure my pastures don't get overgrazed. But paying attention to those seasonal changes is going to be important. And that's kind of where that last point comes in. Keep the horses in dry lots during periods of unproductive growth. So, how frequently you're rotating is going to depend on the size of your pasture, your stocking rate, but also that growth rate. So here we see this productivity. We're mostly seeing our cool season grasses that are most productive in the spring and then have another kind of bump in the fall, but they go through this summer slump. Our legumes get really productive in the spring and kind of decrease over the season. And then our warm season grasses are going to peak in the summer when it's nice and hot. We really don't see warm season grasses in the upper Midwest. Things like teff are getting a little bit more common, but part of my master's research was actually looking at the ability of warm season grasses in even these northern climates to compensate for that summer slump. However, I would say the feasibility of it. Having to seed them, they're annuals, you have to seed them every year. It gets kind of expensive. So it really ended up not being a practical thing to do. So the last thing I want to hit on is winter care. So in the winter, when you're not having pasture growth, how do you handle your pastures? Well, continuous traffic on the pasture can really damage the forage. It can lead to bare spots. The horses might overgraze it. So putting those horses in a paddock or dry lot allow that pasture to rest. You want to make sure going into winter, you're not like, well, the season's done, I'll just let them graze it till it's gone. No, they need enough growth to survive the winter. And so make sure you're at least that 3 inches of growth going into winter. And that way the plants have the reserves they need to survive. Also, a thing to note is that when temperatures fall below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, non-structural carbohydrates, that's the NSC here, they're going to build up in the forages, and they might not be safe for horses who do require a lower NSC diet. We see this elevated amount for about a week or two, and then they should kind of go down and plateau. And so make sure around that first killing frost, you are removing these horses from pasture to prevent that low NSC, and then normally keep them off, or the high NSC, and then I keep them off for the rest of winter to just keep your pasture nice and healthy.